SciArc, Art Center, but currently this year are the visiting teaching fellow at the School of Architecture at Taliesin, which I gather is a unique experience because that school is centered around a design build experience. And we're in the midst of a pandemic, and I assume, Leah, that you're teaching remotely, so I'm sure that's been challenging. Leah's work centers around kind of hybrid digital and physical spaces and materials. Leah's interested in the relationship between technology, nature, culture, and life. And we're really excited to have them here today to share their work and generally have a conversation maybe about the status of this kind of media and mixed reality in architecture and design more broadly. So welcome, Leah. Thanks for hanging out with us for an hour today.
Cool. Thank you so much for the invitation. And it's honestly like when you both reach out to me, Tom, like it's just like a really deep honor to have the invitation to kind of be amongst this crowd of folks that are invited as well. So thank you. And we should, I guess, click forward, right? So I'm just going to start off. I want to keep this as conversational as possible because I think that's the best way to do it. But I just wanted to start by going through a few projects and kind of, we're going to do a little bit of intro dancing around it, but then we'll kind of like dive right in. So this is actually was my second VR project ever. But this is kind of like, this is the first intro. And the question was, what if you could get kind of a psychic reading of your digital history, right? So a palm reading of something that you experienced digitally, whether it's like you typing into Google, and the question was like, you're asking questions to the universe, to the Google search bar. What if you take those questions seriously and then translate them into basically a psychic reading that was from your digital history, kind of your digital presence versus your physical presence only. So it's a way to attempt to collapse the two. Next. And then to start, I just started by making these sorts of diagrams to try to think about how this would become physical and full scale. And I don't know if that's like washed out or everyone can see it. Maybe I should duck. But so the project began with somewhat of a question of what physical distance have I traveled while scrolling online? So that's kind of like as you can see, it's like the translation from the swim stroke as a translation of, say, like zooming in becomes like a breaststroke. And you can see that on the left for the final VR experience, the way you move through space is to literally swim through. So to start for me to understand how we can move through architectural space in an intuitive way versus kind of like a teleportation way or different, the given ways. But yeah, so that basically became the move, like literally you swim in order to move through space. So it was quite intuitive. But yeah, should I just keep saying next? I guess we could go forward. Yeah, and then there's supposed to be, it's like kind of, well, this is supposed to be a video, but it doesn't matter. So on the right, you can kind of see the views of VR and the basic interaction, which in theory you see on the upper right, is kind of like an I Ching initiation process where the cell phone, to some extent, asks you the last time you were online. And you say your name, you say the last time you were online, whether that was 4 days ago or 5 seconds ago. And that's the initiation process for you to then kind of start swimming in space. But it's literally what is fed into the game engine for this VR experience is like your Google search bar readout as translated into a psychic reading that's fit for you. Yeah.
Can we pause there for a minute? Can I just ask a couple questions about the project? Or Ishan, you can go to the next images. I just more wanted to kind of start to ask a few questions about the project. So is the psychic, is the output, like, so if in a traditional psychic reading, somebody tells you things about, like they offer you insights, let's say, about either your near future or even your distant future. In this case, is the reading like the virtual space that you get to encounter, or is okay?
Yeah, it's both in theory. So it's like there's basically 3D models that get dropped in. So they're kind of custom assets that get dropped into this overall kind of cave and cenote space as you go through. And it's kind of going off of, to some extent, the idea that there's some commonality between kind of experience online, whether it be memes. I mean, as you see, there's the poop emoji in front of you. There's like Birdo, there's arcade machines. So there's all sorts of things that kind of sit in kind of like the collective experience of being online versus things that get dropped in that are like that you hit when you search, right? So it's kind of looking for like common threads that can then drop in. Because I didn't get like say like thousands of 3D assets. It was like 100 3D assets that could be kind of customly dropped in depending on people's searches. But for the most part, and we'll see it in the video, the experiences is as you swim, you basically trigger the audio. So when you see the cell phone light up, when Siri begins talking to you, she's your spiritual guide. And she tells you, basically, she walks you through your psychic reading. So at each point in time, as you swim through a different point in the cave, and the cave architecture is also attuned to the types of questions and answers that you're given. Whether you're kind of in a narrow space that's kind of in theory trending to a certain direction. There's all, or like a larger kind of more collectivized conscious space, like the one we're seeing in front. So it's all kind of customized and tuned to that. So the questions and the architecture of the cave go back and forth.
Yeah. Got it. Okay, cool. Yeah, let's watch the video.
Cool. Well, this is, yeah, and this is just, I guess the video's coming up. But this is like the experience of getting to this installation. So the experience is like, it's a VR experience. And typically when you experience VR, it's all kind of purely digital. You're in a digital space that's encapsulated and there's kind of no feedback between the outer experience and the inner experience, or say like the physical material world and the digital space that you're occupying, right? So the funny thing is that you end up looking super goofy in the process. So this was kind of like an idea of when you book an appointment, whether it be a therapy appointment or psychic reading, kind of there's the build-up process of like going and checking in, or like signing into your Google email in order to then access your psychic reading. So all this process, and this is kind of the background for how the actual piece was made. You can see that even there's a physical remnant of that Google or the iPhone. So you have Siri and she's talking to you in real time, kind of in VR, as well as in the actual bathtub as well, which you see at center. These are just some of those custom assets. And then I think the video should be next, right? So this is,
there we go.
This is swimming. So this is kind of the outside experience, which typically, I mean, like as you use VR, you know, especially if someone goes into a headset, it just looks goofy because there tends to be no like relationship with the physical. And this one, at least it was like the first prototype for me to start to understand how you could think of physical space as kind of like a setup for the digital space that you'd then be occupying. So in this sense, you're swimming through a cave, and that cave happens to be led physically by you entering into a bathtub.
And those gloves have sensors on them?
Yeah. So it's there's a sensor on front and the front of the VR headset. You see, this is Theo, so he's another mixed reality artist, architect. And it basically tracks your hands. And then you'll see when you're inside the experience, we can go to the next one too. And when you're inside the experience, you see that you have gloves. So it was a way also to say like, okay, everyone coming through, maybe they have different hand size, different skin tones. If they put on the medical gloves, then it kind of immediately brings them into the space.
Right, because then those are their hands that they're seeing. Yeah.
Hello. Welcome to your internet guided healing session. I'll be your spiritual guide through the waters of the internet. What name do you go by?
So then he said, Jesse.
Welcome, Jesse. When was the last time you were online? Begin centering your energy. I see you recently searched for Kylie Jenner underage plastic surgery tumbler. Bring your attention to your recent search, letting it gradually come into greater focus.
So it kind of goes through, but basically there's some interesting points in this where but there's like questions in terms of like you were located somewhere significant when you search for, like it's kind of like a presencing of your digital kind of history, the things that you don't think about when you're kind of stuck in the space of your cell phone.
I'm seeing what ails you. The water is reflecting that you've been struggling with psychic exhaustion and considering, save YouTube videos, you are still searching for, become a church.
Yeah. So it's all sort of like digital presencing, right? How do we kind of like bring it into our consciousness? It's not something that's kind of like in the cloud or kind of external to our physical reality, but is always a part of us. And so for some people, it became almost like research. Obviously, some of it's funny, but some people really did take it as like an hour-long meditation. So it kind of ran all sorts of varieties of experience. There was a lot of laughter and a lot of like, how did you know that? Yeah.
No, I think, I think you've already touched on it, but I don't think it's immediately obvious, like why, I don't know how to put it, like to symbolize experience of the internet. Like, so I think there's like a large degree of like authorship and decision making there, for you. And so I just wonder if you characterize this as part of like your overall practice, or just like what leads you from the internet to a physical space into a digital space. But I think what's important there is space, right? Like you're taking someone into a different mode of experience where they can encounter a certain kind of information in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most definitely. And I think about this project, and it's been published a lot, which is like the weird thing, because it's something, and I wanted to show it in part because I made it as a student. So this was my architecture thesis. At a time when no one was really doing game engines, and I saw, and we'll go into it kind of like in the end in terms of like just background and inspiration and going over the reading. But really early on, when a lot of people started experimenting with film, I kind of like immediately saw game engines as kind of actually the next platform for architecture in a lot of ways. But yeah, so I mean, for this, it was an idea of course, like this is, I see this as, and I see all my work as this, but this is like a very early prototype for all the work that would come, because it was the first time I actually simultaneously got to think about the way digital space and physical space interact. And it's pretty dumb. You're sitting in a bathtub. It's it's basically an installation piece versus something that's actually tracked in real time and real space. And the cave, just when you start, it's scaled to the bathtub. So the thing you feel around you, the cell phone in front of you, everything matches up between physical and digital. But when you start moving through, it kind of takes away, like you're in another space at that point. You're swimming through an entire cave. And the one thing that I really appreciated seeing this, Tom, was just like also that someone that was 5 years old could enter this. And typically when you put anyone into a VR space and you tell them to navigate, it's really unnatural, and they actually have to use controllers, or they have to like find different ways to either teleport or run on a ball, which like there's all these weird ways of getting around the fact that like it doesn't work. You have to move a lot. There needs to be kind of a syncopation between digital and physical in a way that usually VR doesn't allow for. So for this one, I just told people that were 80 and never had tried VR before, from someone that was sick, they immediately were navigating a cave architecture that I had designed in 3ds Max, right? And then, I could have designed it in Rhino, it doesn't really matter, but then just being able to translate the fact that I could swap in an entire kind of complex architectural network of a cave, and then someone could entirely navigate it up by themselves, just with the initiation of like, okay, now you're going to swim. so that was really exciting to see that. And that was like, so for me, the takeaway that I took was starting to work between actively a little bit more in terms of tracking between digital and physical space. And then, yeah, just thinking of intuitive ways that people start to engage with digital space as well. Because usually it's not. And that, I mean, yeah, and that's kind of, I think that's overall the first project, which is, I wanted to just take note in terms of just saying like, that was a student project. You know, so for me, it was more, yeah, so it's like, I mean, like all these things are different opportunities for everyone to kind of go in and just like think about the way, I mean, and that's the weird thing with me. It started with also a question of like, with all these tools that are available to us nowadays, why do I still have to, like if I have a render, I'm constantly working, whether I'm 3D scanning something or I'm drawing something in Revit or wherever you are, I'm constantly moving back and forth between digital and physical models in space. But somehow I always end up in the end with putting a render or drawing on the wall and then a blank model in front of a person. And they're supposed to, because they're somehow trained as an architect, be able to craft an experience from the conceptual narrative that you tell over these things, versus like, I want someone to just be able to jump into my work and not have me even standing there. So that was like the starting point for a lot of this work as well. This is like, I want to gear everyone towards an experience versus that they come away and learning and kind of, if there's a concept to it, they kind of embody it and they can talk to me about it after, but I don't want to kind of tell them in advance. And then Ellie requested I show desert VFX, so we can go to the next one too. But yeah, so this in a lot of ways, so this is a project I did with one of my best friends, Maxine Lefebvre, as part of Space Saloon, which I'm really in love with the idea of design build architecture. And I'm constantly now trying to push a lot of this mixed reality or like virtual work in that direction, increasingly so. So it doesn't remain, say, in a computer or on a screen or in a VR headset. So this is a project where we basically turn the green screen into a series of props that kind of were caricatures or poked fun at the desert in a very like Jacques Tati way. And that was like the starting point for it. It's like thinking about all the different ways that even before going to the desert or when you're at the desert, the different levels of mediation of a space, especially at somewhere like Palm Springs or Joshua Tree, where there's so much kind of like digital history around like what people search for, whether they go to School Rock, this or that, you know, like that you can look on TripAdvisor or Yelp or kind of have an experience of the desert in a game engine, say in Grand Theft Auto, even before going to this place. So to some extent, it was inspired by a story that I was told of a 5-year-old who in Grand Theft Auto had he played Grand Theft Auto in Los Angeles, so San Andreas Fault. And afterwards, he actually gave a tour of Los Angeles physically because he knew all the landmarks from the game. So that was kind of the first point of like understanding like the mediation of a physical space as we deal with it digitally, just because he was in that scenario the expert of Los Angeles, even though he had never visited there. And we can go to the next. Does this play the video? Let's see. But if it doesn't play, so what this, so to some extent, like I am obsessed with these ASMR videos, and I've made a few of them myself, where it's just you sitting, this is in Grand Theft Auto, but you sitting in, and so this is the Sonora Desert, and they'll just put a camera, and so you get all the sounds of the environment as simulated, you get the wind simulations going through, but it's all about just kind of the experience of an atmosphere as rendered by the game engine. So there's that, and then there's, of course, it kind of fits into the genre of like ASMR and meditation kind of YouTube videos, right? Where you'll log on and just like become a mountain. Like there's like an initiation process to get you to go to sleep or to get you kind of towards a point of self-realization. And I just thought it was a really kind of interesting nexus, and I like to watch these too. So the fact that like, I guess this is like a very like Harun Faraki type discussion too, in terms of like the way we simulate water, the way we simulate wind, and how that, or even like simulating kind of human expression, and how that kind of matches and mismatches from our real life experience of, say, wind.
So Ishan, are you able to get that video to play or no?
No, I don't think there was a video with this file, but there is one later. But
there's one later. Okay, I just want to make sure we see some video of the project. I was wondering, Leah, could you speak for a moment about in a project like this, like where is the project? And what I mean by that is, like, is it for the people who are in the desert and kind of having the experience of the production? Is it for me, the person who later kind of watches the video? And so I guess what I'm saying is like you're speaking about the kind of production of an atmosphere and an experience, and that I think is happening in multiple layers, or like is being multiple forms of representation, let's say too. So like where, I mean, maybe the answer is all of it, but I don't know. Maybe you could speak a little bit about how you understand that distinction. Like, does the project reside in the kind of video at the end, or is there something about all of the process and the experience of making it that you're revealing to us that's also part of the project?
I mean, for me, it's definitely all of it. I mean, I'm actually kind of like anti-video art, a little bit. An anti kind of like a completion point, even though that's the way it got produced and then put out to the world, which you'll see. But for me, it was more like we all had chroma key apps on our cell phones, and we were kind of like live editing, but it was also the process of trying to think through all the different kind of set scenarios that you would have. Like if you were kind of like building a weird narrative, like it is a very strange narrative of like, what are all the things you can play with on site, whether it's your green screening live. Like a lot of these we didn't start painting until we were actually taking the videotape. And so it was more just like, for me, it was like this was done with, even though it was like thought through by two people, it's always a team, and that's a big part of my work now. And so I don't complete any of my work by myself. I was treated as a collaboration. So even though there were 5 students that came along, but they had as much kind of like ideas to where set things up. Like basically the entire portion of the hillside of this desert was a set. And we basically then kind of thought different weird narrative scenarios into it as much as we can. And then we created a composition kind of in between thinking of those scenarios and in between kind of thinking about the site itself, and the way a cactus would sit next to, or fake cactus would sit next to a real cactus, right? So it was kind of all of it.
Yeah, but like if you like, if you could, would there be a version of this project where you would essentially like give this toolkit to multiple groups of people and everybody would produce their own, like the outcome would be different every time, and the thing that you've designed is the experience of producing, producing it with your toolkit? Or is it, I don't know, I'm posing it as an or. I'm just interested, I think, in the multiplicity that's embedded in the project.
Yeah.
Right? Because the other thing is that it just also stands, maybe we should go to the video, but the other thing is that it kind of like stands, or can like stand as a video, or like as something which you experience by watching the making of it, is that, or the like the video of it.
Well, I think watching it, I mean, I think for me, it's also a point of when you make something, it's really, especially because all these things are open source, it's really important that everyone knows how it's made, So a lot of the stuff, I mean, right now we're streaming using OBS, and a lot of this work, from now forward is made using OBS. It's made using obviously green screen, which is so much a part of the tech that we're living in now. Like this is like basically like what the architectural discourse in a lot of ways has become. It's like the square, this rectangle that we're in, and how to kind of get space out of it, right? Or like somehow reimagine space through it. And so for me, it is kind of like, yeah, it kind of functioned weirdly enough as a kit of parts, right? And that in theory, this became a part of my teaching pedagogy, in which I kind of used it as a way that I could say like, okay, like how does a green screen not only become something that's flat, but that has depth and interacts with kind of things backwards in space, whether it's from the stable point of a webcam or maybe moving cameras like your cell phone, you know? So and to some extent, yeah, I would love if people just kept playing with it, you know, because for me, it's like, yeah, we made a pretty film, and that's like the way it gets published, but it doesn't really matter much to me beyond that.
Yeah,
I prefer.
Maybe just one other observation about the project and then we'll stop. But I also, I mean, it's interesting to me too that the chroma key, that the green screen is used in this project as a way to help one actually be more present in their physical world. Like you understand the desert hill that you're on in a different way because you have this green object with you, which is very different than like where the three of us are right now, right? Where the interface with like the physical world has basically been like discarded and we're now just like disembodied in a kind of digital space. And so I think it's rare that you get those two things to actually work together, and that the green screen actually gives you heightened awareness of your physical environment. And so I think that's something I've always appreciated about the project as well.
We can play the video and we can keep talking over it. Yeah, so I think this will go.
I think the like inability to pin down where the project lies is great. I actually feel like that's a really, I think, contemporary production. It maybe ties to the movement. You know, I don't want to like jump the gun and start talking about the but you know, it is the open-ended thing that doesn't have like start or end. It's predictable. That's kind of the point. It reminds me, and I'm just going to point this out right now. So it reminds me of Bishop's writing installation art, and the inherent contradiction about writing about documenting installation art is that installation art, its thing, is exactly not be experienced any other way than going and doing it. You know, so like the fact that almost all installation art, photos and videos, is like a, you know, basically like undermining the entire project, you know, instead of like, I think like this approach is much better, where it's like, well, it doesn't have to be about any one of them. It doesn't have to be about the thing actually happening in time and space. It doesn't have to be about the planning of it or the documenting of it or its circulation on media. Like, it's all just flattened, it seems. You know, there doesn't have to be a crisis of like form. You know, there doesn't have to. We don't have to hand wring over where the project lies.
Yeah. Well, also because I mean, if it's like the process. I mean, like, yeah, we've produced parts, right? But the process, as much as the product is the product, right? Emblematic of anything. Which is kind of like what you're saying, like the weirdness between documenting something that's like an experience for non-knowledgeable, which is, I feel like, was a lot of like a weirdness in terms of how people were talking about how you experience architecture for a long time. It's like early internet. It was just like, well, we're only looking at pictures now, you know? No one's going to actual buildings. No one actually cares. But yeah, and then it's like that's brought to kind of like a hyper reality when you enter in VR space, you know, and just kind of like these capabilities in virtual space, made 3D, but for sure. And yeah, this is like, I mean, I totally geeked out about some of the things, you know, in this film, you know, like there were certain things that I looked for and then carried forward in terms of like understanding like how I might critique someone as we start to literally make dreams for people together. And like in this point where behind you where the digital grass meets the physical grass, right? And so there's a real understanding of like maybe and these were all flat, but like if a green screen was not flat, so it was 3D, that there would be a way of putting an image onto it that it would be kind of like ready to receive, and that you could swap things out digitally and physically, and there would be kind of like a know-how and a knowledge that would be gained through that action, whether it was a scaling thing, like a textural thing, like literally morphing form three-dimensionally. I mean, there's all different sorts of things, but I was really in this really into the idea of like the constant matching or mismatching of between reading, for the most part. It was all flat, but the kind of the desert itself. I really like the idea, Ellie, that you kind of have this paper awareness about the things around you, which we did because, of course, it was scorching heat, and we were, going up and down the hillside, painting in green, in like high-tech outfits by 3. It was just wild. It was terrible. It was a lot of fun. But yeah, and then I just love the point where the live painting becomes, just kind of renders the portal. It all just becomes portals as the next platform through to the digital space that we're seeing. Yeah. And as he exits the hillside, he kind of like his head boops into the top of the hillside of another digital hill. Like, it's super weird. But that you would start to gain kind of like a certain knowledge for the way you would start to interact and track between digital and physical space. So these are all still I'm pretty young, and so these are all like very early prototypes for things that I'm like starting to think through, which I think also to some extent touches on a lot of the questions around kind of, is this architectural? At this point it's all proto-architectural, I think, but yeah. But that's kind of like that project for sure.
Cool. Shall we move to the next one?
Yeah, for sure. And then I basically gets into kind of the teaching practice, which means that I got to work with like 40 students.
All right, Tom, you have to click an icon.
Yeah. Oh no.
Too high. So that was good. You did great. You just lost your hand. That was great. So let's go on my view here. But this was before I was even really teaching, to be honest. But so I wrote a syllabus and I did some weird projects, and basically one of the professors at SciArc became really interested in the practice that I was doing on the side. But so they invited me randomly and crazily to teach the final project for the first year studio first semester, which is just like, what the heck? And now that's what I'm teaching at SciArc, and I'm teaching the first year studio. So it's kind of a very strange intro, but it was interesting because similar to the Ursula Gwynn piece, I kind of prefaced my syllabus with talking about Octavia Butler's reading of magic. And Octavia Butler started her career at age 12 because she watched this on the TV. She watched Devil Girl from Mars. She was 12 years old, and it simply put in her Wikipedia page that she knew then she could write a better story. So at that age, she started writing sci-fi, like feminist pieces. But so that was kind of the intro into a lot of my teaching. But I was doing everything from motion capture, and that's involved here. But this is like views to Unity game engine, but it was taking what I had learned from Desert VFX and then saying, well, what if it wasn't, also I came in project 3 which was the final project for the first year studio, and they already had all this work, right? And so I was like, well, we could basically mine their work as a series of collections and archives, because they made all these 3D models. And I was like, what if we just kind of like put them in and then start to scale things, start to add texture, thinking about digital versus physical texturing of these 3D models that they had made. And so we kind of all threw it into the backdrop. And then, so it was a then point to say like, okay, we can work with the green screen as kind of a flat object, but also as a dimensional object. And then the third point was that they used Unity game engine to then kind of craft these digital objects that they had made onto their body. So that, and you'll see, it's like they even rigged the character but as they moved, then the digital objects kind of went with them. So they designed an avatar and they designed kind of a physical space that was actively like projected in using OBS Studio as well. So we can go to next. And these are just some of the views. So this is their final, like, can you imagine this? This was wild. This was literally their final presentation was a performance. So, and it was, they had kind of a 10 by 15 foot area in which they kind of designed into, and they kind of painted part of it green. You'll see different parts where it's like, it kind of like goes into the back process. Because this is basically after the texture was like put in digitally, right? So these are kind of like the stills, and you could see that they were constantly swapping out scale, texture, form in different ways. That was super, super interesting. And then they had kind of the avatar on top, which you see on the right of that thing there.
Break the fourth wall. I just want to look more closely.
Yeah. I mean, that was the point of the avatar as well. It's like the point where you can't kind of tell fully the two-dimensionality of the space versus the three-dimensionality of it, because otherwise it was like, it was really cool because constantly during the review, you basically had a monitor on one end, and then you had the physical space on the other end. And all the critics were constantly looking back and forth between the two, which is why you see all around Ellie there. That, yeah, basically everyone was looking towards the camera because that was where the monitor was projecting, right? So you kind of saw the space physically and you saw it digitally at the same time, and you just kind of do a head nod. And so the whole, it kind of really made it rather interesting because it didn't put it all on the student to kind of present their work from kind of one perspective, but it constantly was kind of an iterative back and forth. And there was even a melting baby, which is the one that you see, like some of these, like some of their objects, they were like they basically coded different behaviors for it. So it wasn't just like, oh, the object is static. It was like some of these objects actually behaved and moved differently over time. So the rose melted, the baby melted in this view. So it was all kind of like a little bit topsy-turvy for sure. Yeah. And I guess I could go, I think there's a few.
Yeah. Well, I'm conscious of time. So I have like things I want to say, but they almost feel like kind of bigger conversational topics. So maybe I'll hold my thoughts to maybe more of like a ending conversation.
Okay. Yeah. And again, I mean, I'll dip so we can look at the different views. These are all kind of the same model, right? So as I kind of played a video through it. Yeah, there's that. So that's another basically set. They built sets, they built spaces, you know, and then they kind of like got to work in 3 dimensions, but of course they were starting to work on the floor because gravity exists. And on the left, you see it where what was green, right? And she had even worn green pants, this woman, Olivia. So this was her project. There was ones where it's like the bottom near me. I'm just blocking it now. They made it like forced perspective game. And you can just see that.
I think one question that like a lot of students would have when they look at a project like this or a series of projects like this would be like, how do you know when you're doing a good job? Like what are the conversations that you had with the students to help them understand the goal, or like how to develop language, let's say, even to talk about what's happening here, you know, and how to work on it, right? Because I think so much of design is like refining and iteration and like working on something until it's what you want it to be. And this seems like the kind of project, and your work, a lot of your work in a way like that demands its own terms or like its own language in terms of like how you want to describe it or evaluate it. And is that yeah, I almost like want to be a fly on the wall when you're having those conversations with students and here, you know, I'm sure it's like super interesting, but you probably have to help them kind of cultivate that language.
Yeah, because it's kind of atypical from the way that, because we talk constantly when we're presenting, it's like we put it to a place of stagnation. Maybe there's a video, but that's kind of like an internal world. It's never kind of, it's always cut off. When this was like the world is kind of open. And so as they iterated, I mean, they had, I mean, the thing that was I mean, and a tribute to the professors that came before, this project came about. Basically, they were working between kind of scaling digital physical textures, 3D models as ways of iterating on kind of existing models they saw around them. So a lot of them were going to like the dollar store to find textures, and then thinking about how they translate that in Rhino or in 3D models. So a lot of it had to do with what they had already. And then thinking about that as it scaled to real space. And then how basically it became its own vocabulary of how you can kind of see, I don't have like a way to annotate the image, but that there's like a way that when you build a form, there's a way that it wants to receive a certain sort of image and the way that image wants to fall on it. So it's very akin to say like the way that I was looking at, say, the different wind simulations across the digital and physical graphs, right? So it's kind of like starting that as a starting point. And then a lot of it is just like similar to how, so you build a vocabulary, but similar to how, say, we were looking at, what was I gonna say, like an architecture, like in any sort of like architecture presentation, there's kind of like a concept. This one concept was kind of embodied in the presentation itself, but that doesn't mean there wasn't a concept that was driving it. So for this team, they were finding constant affinities the way they would read one object next to another. So there was like a scale relationship where, and at that point, it's like they're creating their own vocabulary as much as like I'm critiquing it, through my own lens. So like we're reading it through kind of their own ideas. So it was a constant way that they were putting, say, a scaled physical texture next to its visual representation, and a lot of it was searched through Google versus found by hand. So it was also a way of like, how do you create a collection of everything that exists in the world? Like there's so much that's around us. So it's like never fully always starting fresh and anew, but thinking about how we bring kind of the existing world in as well, and but then they also, part of it was they took it to Photoshop so that they kind of morphed an image so it would be received, or they painted it white, they changed saturation. So it came to blend into a certain scene. So they had like, it's a video, it's a live video that gets projected into a green screen. So there were certain ways that they kind of thought through that video as like similar to the way I thought through the desert as a set, right? That there would be kind of like scenes and cuts that would get you from one idea to the next. They even had music playing in the background. So it was a lot. But yeah. And then I guess I've been working with some summer programs, so I can, Sean, if you want to switch it out, you can look at the other one. Okay, click. Thanks, Ellie. So this was somewhat similar, but so this is it's called Monster Objects. There's the chat in front. I haven't even looked the whole time, I apologize. But basically, so these were high school students. So this was like their pre-college experience. And yet again, I was brought in to kind of teach one project with them. So this was called Monster Objects, which was they built large physical sets, they built a physical puppet, and then they built a digital puppet in Unity Game Engine. And then the two got mapped and tracked onto another. So it's similar, like I'm using a lot kind of like theatrical, like in terms of like set building, foreground, background, and then there's kind of like a puppet performance. And it was a way of them kind of being able to understand how you would start to gain a know-how. So there's a VR controller, which you can see near Ellie, slapped onto that physical puppet, right? So
is it above me? I can't tell.
It's right to the right. It's a little blurry on my screen because I'm looking at it in Zoom.
Like right here?
It's down to the bottom, right by his hand. So, and that was basically a way, again, to start to map digital objects with physical objects. So it's kind of this discussion around certain affordances that you get with VR, or any sort of like object, like your phone, like your live tracking. So with VR, if you're live tracking and you can kind of then overlay kind of like a way that you would move a physical object that you're holding to a mapping of it in digital space. So as I rotate a VR controller on, say, a physical puppet, then I would also rotate a model in digital space. And so that then became superimposed. And so students were then, holding their puppets and looking at themselves kind of performing the digital puppet at the same time. And we can go to the next. So that was kind of the experience. And this was one that was like very, very good because it didn't think about the puppet per se as a marionette figure, even though that's kind of the logic, because the way you rig in digital space is very akin to the way you think about rigging a physical marionette or physical puppet. But they thought of it as like an architectural atmosphere. So as you moved it around, it became an atmosphere that you could like explore versus kind of like a consolidated object or subject.
It's really invading my space.
And we can go to the next. I'm looking at time too.
Did you find that the students were really game for what you are having them do, or was there?
Yeah, they were obsessed.
Yeah.
I mean, they're like literally they're 13 to 18-year-olds, and because this was 3 days, right? So like when I'm brought in, especially as someone who's not experienced in teaching, I'm brought in for like a very short period, and I'm suggesting we do something pretty big. I mean, like they started using Unity. They built these physical sets. Like it was kind of wild. So it was a lot of like learning from the tools that they had already learned yet again, but also like progressing it into something entirely new. But yeah, they said it was their favorite project for sure.
3 days is crazy.
3 days is crazy. And the first day we just started by kind of like thinking through the sets and then creating narratives around it. And then the narratives, similar to the way, that's kind of like a back and forth between like what you think of kind of architecture concept versus kind of like a narrative. And I guess that's a big part of like world building, right? But yeah, like a narrative that kind of gets you started, something that you can like, whether it's a character or it's the context that helps you build out an entire world, and then starts to kind of like say, oh, I would take this model and I would color it this way versus another way, right? So you can start making decisions by weighing it against the story overall versus the way it's done in architecture always, where you kind of weigh, say, a building detail against a concept. So it functions really similarly, but it just happens to be interactive and experiential immediately in a way that's rendered digitally and physically. And then I wanted to just, I guess, end for Tom, because it's so much akin to what you're going to be doing. So this is Design Immersion Days, is a summer program that's taught at SciArc. It's 5 weeks. Of course, the first time I was only brought in for 3 days, so it was quite short. But this time I ended up leading Design Immersion Days, but it was all taught on Zoom. So we had to think of a way of iterating this project over Zoom. So that was kind of, we can go, Sean, if you want to go to the next, we can go to the next project.
Welcome to
so we did a virtual
TFW,
puppet production.
WFH,
oh yeah, and then I'll
TW,
invite Tom
TBH, IDK, FTW, a virtual puppet production.
Definitely feel like I'm being interviewed by the authorities.
Right now.
You probably deserve to be interviewed by the authorities, Tom.
Oh my God. You're in a basement, by the way.
I'm in a basement.
They took you down. They took you down. So this is without the narratives, but basically groups of students work together to like create virtual backdrops, create face filters. So we thought of the face as a way to control like puppet mechanisms. So some people even use their hands to kind of trigger events. And the cool thing about this is some of the students were really into it. We're building, and you can see that it's not a typical virtual backdrop. They've actually crafted out of green paper. They cut it so that it would fit into their kind of home environment. So you can kind of see their rooms while seeing the green screen. So it's a way of understanding the green screen yet again as kind of a foreground or a background object. So he just put the green paper across Angel, some of the others like really carefully articulated the way they would cut it out. But yet again, it's always kind of like the stable webcam. But this by far, I mean, all the students yet again, so this was their favorite. But and the thing is like it's also a larger discussion of like learning through play, which is a lot of what, especially for the younger students, is a lot of like we bring in kind of architectural concepts and ways of working, just kind of in a necessarily performative way. Like we prototype and then we try something on, we prototype and then we enter into a space. So it's kind of always interactive. You can touch a button and the experience would change, right? Or you could flip out an image and you would look different.
No, it's like zeitgeist. This is, like, I mean, I honestly, like I think one of the important differences between what the students are working on right now is that they started with just an image of what's behind them.
Yeah.
And being asked to like modify it to reveal and conceal. So it's like definitely much more of a, I don't know what the right word is for it, but like taking into account like the pixels that are behind them, when they're at their webcam, and then modifying it from there.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, like, I think it's similar to what Ellie was saying with the desert VFX. Like, you see people kind of adjusting the way that they're reading the space that they're in. Whether it's something they're holding in front or something that's behind them, they're constantly like adjusting their webcam to kind of like hold something together image-wise. And this is like, I mean, there's different ways that you kind of can expand beyond this as well. So it becomes kind of more depth, not only kind of like a 2D prop. But
I see the work. I don't want to like jump into like some forced stuff, but there were a bunch of really great like comments from the students, so I wanted to try to give voice to some of those. I think like one that comes to mind is I think many students ask this question in like slightly different ways, which is like if we go back to the Le Guin or to the Twitch video, kind of undermining of conventional ideas of like narrative or goal-oriented production, and there's also like a gender politics to that. But I think a lot of students were curious, like, what does like a Le Guin architecture look like? What's like the carrier bag architecture? I think your practice offers one answer to that, but also like, what's the carrier bag like architect or practice look like? Like what's the both the content and the form? So like how can we bring these insights both into the spaces that we make as architects and also just how we operate in the world as a practice, as a field? I know it's a question, like, and I think like your entire practice is like an adequate response to that, I think, but I'm just curious what how you might help some students understand that.
Yeah, well, I think there's so many different aspects. It's kind of like, it's similar to how does this relate to architecture, which I say, like this, what is the application? Like all these things, like it is kind of a superimposing of the same sort of questions, weirdly enough. But I mean, for me, I think it's also a question that is super relevant to sort of the decolonialist practices and like discourses that hopefully everyone is having today as well. So it's a little bit of undermining, and I also make memes, so that's part of my practice, is also finding sorts of new audiences, as well as like just kind of bringing other people in. A lot of the memes I make, I call student solidarity posts, but for me, the practices that like I think of as being carrier bag is also to undercut kind of a heroic architect, like we're talking about kind of the hero's journey. For one, it's to start to undercut kind of the discussion around a heroic architect, which always, in the process of, at least definitely in school, kind of always looks at a figure and undermines kind of the collaborative effort that goes behind it. So it's somewhat of that. Also, it's, let's see, I mean, there's so many different aspects to it, but it's also like a discussion that undercuts formalism as well. So for me, it's part of that. But also I use like core to everything that I do is using the technologies that are available today. So game engines, weirdly enough, have been used now and increasingly so to kind of render the world realistically, right? So we kind of think about photorealism. And I think that kind of fits into sort of the same genres as we're always trying to put kind of a normative thing, a normative view onto the way we look at these things. So it's always interesting to me when I started doing this sort of work, people are working in film to kind of render out, say, 2,000 frames to make an animation of something that looks just like the same that you would experience in real life anyway, you know, versus like, how do we think about, you know, whether it's a cartoon way of drawing something or like something that empowers someone to kind of think imaginally in the process, right? So it's also an incomplete architecture. Because maybe we design, I mean, a lot of my practice, it's like it's all roundabout ways of answering your question. But I think the only, let's say the only, I mean, there's VR, there's AR, and we can talk about those as different spectrums along like a line, you know, in terms of mixed reality. But the only, say, really good AR experience that exists now that isn't just kind of AR as an information layer on top of digital space, on top of physical space is Pokemon Go, right? And it's like in Pokemon Go, there became a term called Pokemon Go urbanism, right? So it's like that completely changed all these things. Digital space completely changes the way we inhabit and relate to physical space, and architects really haven't picked that up really quite yet. So for me, it's also thinking of different ways that we imagine using game engines that we can kind of like create new imagery to exist. You know, so that's the green screen. Someone's asking like, what is the purpose of application? It's thinking about, for one, how does digital space even relate to the physical world? You know, how do we start to not just composite, but like actually work with the two in real time? So that's kind of a huge part of my research, and that's what this is part of the discussion of like affordances that are given by the tools of, say, a VR headset, which is a glorified 360 camera, versus, you know, say like the VR hand controller, which can easily be a camera too, if you just slap a camera on it in the game engine and then rotate it. So there's all sorts of like affordances that are given, and it's also a big part of I guess my research overall is like, how do you start iterating kind of back and forth between digital and physical space in a way that doesn't just constantly profess to be one narrative put forward by one architect, you know, but also actually allows for narrative multiplicity. So I think even like the Twitch, and we can also go to the next, we're gonna flip here, but like, and we can actually just go to the Twitch view if that's possible as a start. And then there's the Ursula Le Guin piece. But
the first simulation
so
called
this is
Squad of Gods takes place on the
started.
side of a volcano.
And this is Ian Chang. So and I don't want to like undercut and like quickly get around your question, but like basically it's like for me, carrier bag architecture, there's all different tools, and it's like, how do you just undercut certain things that are like put forward, you know, and are very typical in architecture. So, and I got into this work and I got into game engines, honestly, because I saw the work of Ian Chang back in 2016. And I literally sat in that gallery for 2 hours, and I felt like I was in a game engine, but I was in a space, and that space was thinking, it was emergent. Each character kind of had its own behavioral role that changed over time. And I was like, to me, very intuitively, I was like, I think this is the future of architecture. And I didn't even know what that meant yet. And a lot of this work is like, I don't know until I talk to people about it, you know, like I have an intuition. Of course, I'm looking at kind of tech and this kind of conversation around affordances, but you kind of have to do it in order to kind of get any sort of feedback and then design forward. So even right now, the Twitch discussion relates a lot to what I'm working on at Taliesin, which we're doing a design build, but as iterated live through Twitch. So, so they're building a partially physical architecture that then, you know, using 3D scanning, you can go and inhabit it digitally and physically at the same time, and those are overlaid. And then you can say, build a crop, or, kind of like have architecture behave digitally and physically in weird ways over time. And that's just iterated on similar to, and we can go to the next video. We can skip over because this is part of the discussion anyway. But this, right, where you're inhabiting the space, and this is totally Ursula Le Guin, except for one, the main difference being is that you're constantly in just like a game engine environment here. And so my practice is like now saying, well, how do you get out of just this? Because what's so cool about game engine technology is that they're constantly, like, it relates to a real space very easily, especially using the tools, the VR controllers, VR headsets. And when you set up a VR space, it is called it's like spatial scale. It's called a room scale, and that exists for a reason, because you're inhabiting a digital room as well as a physical room. So it's starting to understand how you can kind of iterate and remove the layers of digital space in order to show physical space behind it. And there's so many architects, especially Lyda, who's coming through, who like their work already kind of exists in this sort of discussion. But for me, I use game engines and different affordances that those allow to start to collapse those two. And here, what's cool is the chat box, which I'll point to if I can. It's a way that if anyone picked up, like the whole discussion around the hero's journey here is undercut by the fact that anyone can go on and turn the light higher, right? By just putting in the chat box. So like, imagine if like that becomes a way, and it is already a way. It's like the call and response between, say, like an Amazon, I don't even know, Alexa, right? Where you can constantly say like, turn the lights on before I get home, So it's like, we're already interacting with things this way. And a lot of my practice is just kind of understanding how you take it seriously, the designing of digital space and physical space at the same time versus like just letting them constantly drift away from one another. So yeah.
I think another like really important aspect of your work that makes it more carrier back is the fact that you kind of reveal the means of production, because it eliminates the idea that that like you are a kind of singular creative genius who's like gifting the world the kind of products of your creativity, but it's actually like it's laid bare, and the process, I think, is one of the ways in which you invite people into the work that you're producing, right? And it doesn't detract from the impact of the work to reveal the way in which it's made. So maybe it just gets back to what you were saying about photorealism, right? But the point is not to produce like other worlds which like stand in for this one, but it's actually that you're identifying a condition which already exists, which is that we exist in a hybrid space. And you're saying, well, if we actually pay attention to that condition and try to work on it, what can we produce? Because I mean, digital technology has already changed the built environment. It's already changed the physical world that we inhabit and the way we relate to it. I think we just don't see it, right? I think we don't pay attention to it.
Yeah.
And so when you do these projects where the kind of the magic, the trick is revealed, like there's never an attempt to like hide what it is. I think that that's like really powerful, because it actually makes the tool more I don't know, like the presence of the technique actually makes one understand that this is happening all around us all the time. As opposed to some kind of like magical illusion. So like in the desert video, the fact that like from the beginning, the stage is set, we understand that there are these green objects, green Tyvek seats. It doesn't take away, actually, I think, from the effects of what happens later when those get, when the digital and the physical overlay.
Yeah.
And it's way better than like behind the scenes of, I can't even think of a blockbuster movie, but like where suddenly you see that somebody's riding like a mechanical elephant in like a sound stage, with like a bunch of plywood and like a ladder. And then, I don't know, like, I think when they compare and contrast those scenes, you're supposed to be in awe of the virtuosity of the digital
like
production.
the addition, yeah.
Yeah, but instead you're just like, but the physical space that this person is in sucks, like like I don't know, like I feel like your work offers the promise that the digital mediation actually makes the physical world we inhabit a better one.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, and that we like actually can access that. Like for me, it's like I agree. It's like I want. I mean, I call all these things proto-architectural because, of course, they feed back into the way we could design architecture. I just think we really haven't yet. Like we constantly are designing in virtual spaces. Architecture, in many ways, up until it's built, is all virtual already. And that's like is to some extent the profession of architecture, especially in school. And so for me, it's like I want to put these sorts of works forward just honestly, so people can understand the affordances that are given. And then I would be so happy if 200 people, like, and never noted me or anything. Like that's way cooler. Just because, I mean, now we see it. We don't need to claim anything. It's just like we should be thinking about digital space as we're designing physical space. We should be thinking about physical space as we're designing digital space. Like, why am I stuck in a Rhino view? That's boring. So like, just like, yeah, some of it just comes with, I think we have so many tools for iterating and we have so many tools to think about these things. We just kind of stagnated. And many times because, I mean, carry your bag is also in relationship to corporations and, VR companies that give these things to you in one way of looking at it, but that's actually very systematically like small as like a point, so you can't actually iterate and design with it in the way that you would do. So a lot of what I do is just messing with the tools, saying like, I'm actually never going to put a headset on ever again. I'm going to put it on a chair, and have that chair turn in circles for 1 hour, and then I'm going to put the VR controller on that side of the room so I know where the wall is. So it's fundamentally taking apart what's given to us as a way to say like, I want to design more physical spaces with digital objects. I want to design more, and vice versa. So it's trying to leave things a little bit more open versus saying like I'm just going to inhabit a digital world, because that's also like, I mean, there were like in the 90s and early 2000s all these books on virtual architecture, and it's like they're so similar to like the discussion around Ursula Le Guin, where it's like the hero's journey. To me, that's like all these things are really apocalyptic, right? It's like, oh, there's never going to be physical space. We're never going to design physical or inhabit physical space again. We're all going to be in VR headsets. It's like, no, like, yeah, I guess Mark Zuckerberg wants you to do that, but like, you don't offer me a way out of that either. So wouldn't it be cooler if you actually designed a way that I could inhabit both? So I thought about the world as hybrid, because it already is. So I think a lot of those sorts of kind of like early tech guru type architects are I find them to be very apocalyptic. So so it's part of like starting to undercut a lot of that dialogue as well.
Mm-hmm.
I have a few questions. Now I'm going off the book from student questions because I'm just very curious. I'll start with an observation, then 2 questions. Well, first is like in the ARC project that's currently behind you, like I just love the trade-off between like resolution and frame rate, as a way to think about architecture and specifically your practice, so there's the like high res, like high fidelity, attitude of rendering. And I'm sure you know about these, but these fetish objects of like environment map, that are really meant to like simulate a photo studio, which is reverse, right? You're basically like trying to simulate the artifice of making an image because that makes it look more real, or like smudge masks and like all that stuff of like going to excruciating lengths to produce like verisimilitude, when actually if you just gave up on all of that and privileged interaction and engagement, which is what I think your work does, and what the project that you had the students look at does. It privileges those other qualities of architectural and spatial material experience. Like it doesn't have to like aspire to visual verisimilitude. Maybe there are modes of verisimilitude which actually have to do with interaction and engagement. But then I have 2 kind of questions. One, just like your relationship to software and hardware and technology in general. I think students would probably be hearing your thoughts on that. Again, you've already touched on it in a way. And a related question is like, yeah, like honestly, I feel like your work is like pretty optimistic. And I don't know if I'm mischaracterizing it, you know, because I think a lot of practices, especially like in the history of architecture, like speculative practices that tended to be critical, tended to be pretty cynical too, and pretty pessimistic about, you know, especially in the 60s and 70s, consumer culture, and then in the 80s and 90s, like technology and capitalism. And, you know, and so I think like your work seems to have a more like open relationship to technology and spatial experience. So that was a lot, but I'm just curious, like, you seem like an optimist. I don't want to mischaracterize your attitude, but yeah, what about tech? Like, how do you feel like students should engage it as architecture students in 2020?
Well, the funny thing is, because I had also the question of how is this architectural type thing when I was teaching over Zoom, right? And I was doing the puppet production. It was by an incredibly smart student, and so I took the question very seriously. But also, it was funny because I'm like, at the point where people think and are looking at my work, because it kind of like is a nexus for a lot of the things that are going on now. That I actually feel it's far less relevant, you know, but it's like increasingly more relevant. Because for me, it's like I want to be in like next to a facade in a room in the city, you know. It's not like yes, the work overall functions from a stable webcam view, but like if that's the way we're coming at it and coming out of it, then that's a point of actually distinct pessimism, you know. But I think the work has optimism because I think similar to the hero's journey overall, as we already know, it's deeply pessimistic from the very beginning. So I think optimism comes from the space of understanding everything else as potentially, you know, singular view or, you know, pessimistic or destructive or apocalyptic anyway. So I think in many ways that's where I come from. Like if I have optimism, it's because I want difference. And I see a point of difference. And also because I think there's tons of narratives that haven't even been touched upon. And there's tons of audiences that haven't been touched upon. You know, there's so much there that I feel like overall architecture is always privileged a certain type of thing. And it'd be really cool to not. And I think the discussion between physical and digital is part of that, you know, just as much as like tech companies say the cloud is not real, but we know it exists everywhere in a data center that's like literally taking raw resources, as does your cell phone. Like there's people mining for these things, you know, that there's kind of nowhere that digital space does not touch. There's a really good meme too where it says, lamps and video games use real electricity, and it's Lisa Simpson saying it. It's one of my favorites, but so it's kind of like that dialogue. It's like, duh, you know, like where do you think these things come from, you know, and who do you think does the labor to make these things possible in the first place? So I think for me, the optimism comes from a place, pessimism, but also just like a way of like, if there's going to be any opportunity to design or like who should be designing, it's like to design our way in and out of things. So like it's doing both at the same time. It's saying no to something, you know, and recognizing what it is and saying yes to everything else. So I mean that's like big, but yeah.
I guess, I mean, I think, and maybe both of you could help me understand the question more deeply if I'm misunderstanding the question, but like it seems it's not a new thing that architecture encompasses more than the design of a building.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, architecture has always been narrative, storytelling, visualization, technology, like all of those things. Even, you know, the intersection of virtual and physical space, I would say, like conceptually has been part of architecture forever.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised, I guess I'm surprised that it seems like you get this question from, like, yeah.
Never at SciArc though.
Well, of course not. You are architecture for SciArc, but like, I guess, yeah, I guess I'm surprised. Like maybe, you know, what is the context that we think that question, from where that question is coming, I guess would be one thing I'm wondering.
I think, I mean, Tom, maybe you could, but it also like, I think it's two things. It's like the architecture, especially in school, is always hypothetical, it's speculative, but it's a practice of making and figuring out a building for the most part, right? But it builds into the larger dialogue, which I kind of hate, but that's what like I love it and I hate it at the same time, where architecture since 16th century forward, like was like the philosophical side of like thinking about building minus the actual craft side of it, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, when I try to say like, oh, the work is proto-architectural, it's because I don't ever want to say it's architecture, because I think it, for me, relates, like I want to get into the place. Like I'm not hell-bent on designing a building, because I think half the buildings are designed around ego and capital, and it's not what I'm about. But that's not to say I don't want it to impact kind of the built environment and buildings as we know it. I would love that. I'm just not quite there yet. So I say it's,
but I guess, but that assumes that in order to be architecture, it needs to impact building, and I don't think that that's true.
Well, I don't think that that's true, but I think that's the larger narrative that I actually also struggle with. Like architecture as it was designed as a discipline is always virtual. Like it is not real. Like, and that's what I think sucks, honestly, because I think, it's really good because it means we have a lot of ability for imagination and speculation and kind of designing, say, the world differently from where we're at now. But, and like also just studying the world, right? But in terms of like material flows, spaces, like there's so many different tools that are to be gained as an architect. In part because of that tradition of architecture speculation, the fact that it's virtual, blah, blah, blah. But what I always hate about it is that it's the fact that the speculative architect who doesn't really, I think it's always just like a privileged position, you know? And that's what I struggle with, because it actually made it so people could make buildings that were totally devoid of humanity, you know? When actually all the stuff that I do with tech is actually trying to say like, trying to bring it back to the scale of a person. You're muted. Sorry, you're muted. You're muted. Wait, Tom, can you hear her?
No, I can't.
I'm gonna see if the chat. Oh, someone posted the lamps meme. That's good. Also to Leah, the architect, no, that's not true. It's just an option.
Yeah, and we should wrap up soon. I'm realizing that it's almost 2:30. I know everyone's busy and we should move on with class. But yeah, this is great. I appreciate your time and your thoughts and the work you do. And I don't know, do you have any last thoughts, Ellie or Leah? Do you have any parting?
I just lost you guys for like 3 minutes, so I don't know what you just said.
We were just doing call outs. It was not 3 minutes, but yeah.
Well, I was like, do you have any more thoughts, Tom? And then everything froze, and then you guys were talking, but I couldn't hear you, and then I don't know what happened.
No, you kept moving, but you were just silent for us.
I just said the weirdest thing I've ever said, Ellie, and you missed it.
Right here, Tom, right here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was really, like, I know it sounds cliche, but it was really inspiring to see the work and hear you talk about it. And just thanks for sharing your time and your work with us.
That's awesome. No, I mean, I super appreciate even like platform getting to talk with both of you, even though the students are just, Tom answered the meaning of life. I'm looking at the chat. Yeah, Tom answered the meaning of life. I think we're good.
High frame rate. Life should be.
But thank you.
Did I miss you? I missed you answering the meaning of life. Oh, when I couldn't hear you. I see.
You missed it. Lamps are real.
Lamps.
So Leo Architect says, only through augmented reality can we make the physical space more enjoyable and true. The answer is no.
Definitely not.
Not only through augmented reality. I'll just echo Tom's gratitude and appreciation. And it's good to see you, Leah.
Good to see you.
It's been fun.
Thank you so much.
Everyone, we'll just go right over to our section Zooms. I'll see my.
Unless it's next semester, in which case you'll go to my section Zoom.
That's
I
right.
want to go to that section.
I know, this is such a.
I just have to leave and go teach another class.
Oh man.
I'm excited.
Leah will be back next semester for a short stint. Anyway, maybe, yeah, well, the edit is interesting on this, but also thank you, Ishan, who's in the background making all this happen. So
Ishan, Paul.
So much, Ishan. Troubleshooting
Bye.
morning. Thank you. See y'all.
Bye, everybody.
bye, everyone.